Alrighty, I guess we're ready. I can't see my screens at all because it's so bright out. Nice. So, last week's stream didn't really work all that well. I had a big gap in the middle and a big gap at the end. One due to my incompetence and one due to technical problems. So, we're redoing the whole thing. I'm not going to be able to do more than what was there because I got a bunch of stuff I got to get done today, which I'm not super thrilled with, but them's the breaks. Yeah, so it'll be a solid 30 pages worth of material, give or take. Alrighty, so, I can't even remember what happened for the week before last. Oh, right. Meg and Sal have some plot or plan going with the Shepherds, who are in a third-party organization of some kind who works out in the belt. And right now they've got a plan to bring Decker out with them because the Shepherds want them to do this thing, because presumably they're going to rendezvous with them, but we're not sure of that yet. Let's see. That's the biggie. Other than that, Ben's still a dick, Bird is old and sentimental, and Decker is a space cadet, but not in the good way. He's getting better, though. He's getting a lot better. After seeing all those sleeping pills, he really has become rather galvanized, which is nice to see, instead of asking about the time and generally being a traumatized basket case. He's still very traumatized, though. It is not a pleasant thing that happened to him and his partner at all. So it's totally understandable why he is the way he be. Alrighty, that is enough gabble out of me. Let me get some additional water in me, and I'll get cracking on rereading the thing that we already read. Okay. Chapter 14. Spending his sleep time with Bird wasn't exactly what Ben had planned. Breakfast with Decker wasn't his idea of a good time either, but Bird insisted. So here they were, himself and Bird at the table, and Decker in line. Meg and Sal were sleep-ins. They'd gotten in late last shift, up to what Ben didn't try to imagine. Decker hadn't seemed enthusiastic about their company from his side either. Decker had answered his door, said yeah, he'd be there, and arrived late, clipped up to the sides and all. All he needs is a couple of earrings, Ben muttered. Be nice, Bird chided him, over the sausage and unidentifiable eggs. Ben looked at him, lifted a chilled shoulder. Hey, did I do anything? But he reminded himself he had better bite his tongue and keep criticisms of Bird's previous pretty boy to himself. The way he'd made up his mind yesterday that since the insanity had gotten to Meg and Sal, he had as well go along with it. Bird shot him a look that said he didn't trust him not to knife Decker in his bed. That was the level things had gotten to. That was the primary reason he figured he had better go along with it. Until Decker slipped up. Then he was even going to be charitable about, I told you so. He sincerely was. so long as Bird saw it clear when it happened and came to his senses. So Decker walked up with his cup of coffee and his eggs, not quite looking at either of them, kicked back a chair, and sat down. "I have to apologize," Decker said, first off, still without looking at them. Ben manfully kept his mouth shut. "I sort of wandered off yesterday," Decker said. Bird shrugged, but Decker wasn't going to see that gesture, looking at his plate like the Z-out he was. Bird said, "Pills will do that." "I'm going off them," Decker said. His hand with the fork was shaking. Badly. A real mess, Ben thought. Wonderful. We're supposed to go out there with this guy. This is going to be at the controls out there. Decker did look up then, shadow-eyed as if he hadn't slept much. "I cut you off yesterday. If the offer's still open, I'd like to talk about it." "Offer's open," Bird said. Ben thought, hell. Decker didn't say anything for a moment, just stirred his eggs around on his plate. Then a second look at Bird. "So I want my license back. What's the time worth?" "Depends on your work," Bird said. Ben did a fast calc, what Decker had, what gave them a solid return on putting up with him. 10K flat, with a guarantee you get the license. Decker looked bewildered, maybe a little overcome at the price and not understanding the quality of what he'd just thrown in. He wasn't exactly sure why he'd thrown it in, except he'd had this nanosecond of thinking he'd asked high and Bird was already on his tail. So it just fell out of his mouth. "There you are, fancy boy. I can fix it. I can. So you damned sure better mind your manners with me." Bird didn't say anything. Decker didn't. So Ben added, with a certain satisfaction, "Fair, isn't it? Guaranteed, Class 1." Bird looked a little worried, but he still didn't say anything. "Whose guarantee?" Decker asked. Ben gave him a cold stare. "Mine. On the other hand, if you ask anybody the time, Decker, if you pull any shit on us out there, you'll take a walk bare-assed." "Ben," Bird said. "I'm serious," he said, and Decker looked worried. "Ben's all right," Bird said. "He really is." Decker said, finally, I haven't got any other offers." "Small wonder," Ben said, and realized that he'd broken his resolution a tick before Bird glared at him. Decker glared at him too. Decker said, "I'll pull my weight." Ben said, "Damn right you will. You'll do whatever you're told to do. And you'll put up with whatever shit you're handed, whatever you think of it, with no gripes." Bird said, "Ben?" Decker glumly reached across the table. It took a moment before Ben realized he wanted his hand, that Decker was truly calling his bluff and taking the deal. Damn, Ben thought. He had as soon stick his hand in a grinder, but things with Bird were precarious. So he made a grimace of a smile, gave Decker his hand, and they made a limp, cheerless handshake across the plates. No one looked convinced, not Decker, not Bird. He certainly wasn't. But he said, "All right, if we're going to do this, let's get that recert application in right now. I take it you haven't done that." "No craters," Meg said as they walked out into the bar. They'd come in late last shift. They'd slept late, gotten up and come out on the absolute tail end of breakfast. No Decker, no Bird, no Ben. Meg shoved her hands into her pockets and looked at Mike over the bar. Sal looked too, with a lift of the eyebrows. "They kill each other?" she wondered. Mike said, dishing up the last of the rubbery eggs. "Left like old friends, all three. Said, tell you they were going up to the dock. They're leaving you a pile of scrub up and sanding in the shop." "Fun," Sal said sourly. "Ben with Decker?" Meg said, with a gathering worry.
Not damn likely. We got a problem here.
Sal poured her own coffee and took the plate Mike handed her. Katie, I think we got to use strategy.
What strategy? I vote we shoot Ben.
Nah, he's playing along with Bird. Sal took the plate and the coffee back to the table and hooked a chair out, as Meg did the same. We got, what, 3 weeks if we push it? If Deck's able to pitch in, the guys are going to be in trouble. Tres macho.
Trez pain in the ass. If Bird takes a position, you need a pry bar.
We can't have Ben and Decker in the same ship. That's prime.
So Bird takes Decker, and we take Ben.
That, come to think of it, wasn't at all a bad idea. They'd been after Ben's numbers for 2 years. That was solid, and Shepard promises were come-ons and maybes. Besides which, if there was anybody who could keep Decker in line... Sal ducked her head, checked in her pocket a beat. God, smooth move there, Meg thought, with a knot in her stomach. And Sal looked up with the devil's own ideas in her eyes. I'll tell you what we do, Katie. We apply to go out in tandem. All of us. I'll tell you why. A jab of Sal's finger on the tabletop. Because Bird doesn't want Decker sliced and stacked. Because Bird's had one trip with Ben and Decker already, and if we give him the out to break that up, we ask for even split on the board time, just to make him believe it. We set it up with the bitch, and we get Ben and his numbers and access to Decker.
Hell, we've got a ship coming out of refit. Shakedown run.
That's the grounds. Only reason they'll do it.
A squash noisy. Do we need Mam Bitch's special attention on us? I don't think a special app is a good idea.
Katie, we got the bitch's attention. I'll ask my friends, but I don't know what worse we can do. And if they say do it, and if she'll let us, hell, if we can get out there tandem, we could just do our job, just ride it out while the shit flies, as may, and figure things are getting taken care of. They're not going to arrange anything on the way out, not unless they're pushed, and if the association brings it up as an issue, damn sure the bitch isn't going to run us into a rock on the way back. There's coincidences, and there's coincidences. They're just a little from having the EC down their throats. You had to wonder whether more understandings might have passed in that little encounter at Scorpio's than Sal had even yet admitted, and Mom Bitch beaming them up to V on a heading Mom Bitch picked, on charts that might have a little technical dropout right in their path, hadn't helped her sleep at all. Ma'am Bitch was finally admitting in the news how she might go grievance procedures with the Shepherds to settle the outstanding complaints and patch up the sore spots. Ma'am Bitch having this severely important production schedule to meet, because the Fleet High Command was breathing down her neck. That was the public posture. Behind the doors in management, there were careers on the line. There was the Shepherds' whole existence on the line.
I tell you, she said to Sal over the eggs, I'd sincerely like to know if you know anything additional, now or in future.
If I know, you'll know. A solemn look. I swear.
Thanks,
She said. She did try to believe it. A berth with the Shepherds, Sal said. It was already an endangered species, and they themselves were fools to think otherwise. You got out of the habit of long-term thinking, when the only out you had was a break in a business that was already taking the deep dive to hell. Free runners weren't going to last forever. Go with the lease deal or go for broke Sal's way. See if the Shepherds kept their bargains, or if there was a bargain, or if the Shepherds were still independents when the shakedown came. Shakeout came, sorry. Sal had wanted this break. God, she'd chased it for years. Blew it once, by what she knew, and those sons of bitches relatives of hers had kept Sal on a string for near 6 years. Sure, let the kid be eyes and ears on Hell Deck. Let Abujib run their errands and risk arrest. Let Abujib sweat long enough to be sure she took orders. Abujib had gotten a severe warn-off from the Shepherd Association when she'd taken up with her, and being Abujib, she'd locked on to her mistake and damned the consequences.
Her high and mighty friends had said, "Drop Katie," and Sal had gone to talk to some officer or other. God only knew what she had said in that meeting, or what they'd said or threatened. But Sal had still. Bleh. Okay, let's try that sentence again, because I messed it up. Her high and mighty friends had said, "Drop Katie," and Sal had gone to talk to some officer or other. God only what she'd said in that meeting, or what they'd said or threatened, but Sal had stormed out of their exclusive club and not talked about a berth with the Shepherds for a better part of a month. They'd survived the ups and downs since, gotten hell in a way better than they'd started. Things had looked so clear and so possible, till yesterday, till the association dangled Sal's dream in front of her, the bastards. She'd said yes to Sal last night. She had the sinking feeling this morning she'd been a chronic fool and committed herself to something she wouldn't have, except for those 2 marguerites. But she hadn't exactly come up with an effective no this morning, either, both of them sitting here betting their necks on that little green light. Sal was dead set. She still couldn't open her mouth and say, "Sal, no deal. We're going with the lease." Didn't know if you'd call it friendship. Didn't know what was wrong with her head. But the way things were getting to be on R2, the free runners didn't have that many more years. She could worry about Bird. You couldn't call it romance, what she had with Bird. Mutual good time. And a guy she'd no desire to see run up against a rock, damn it. If Decker was the problem, they were all tagged, as the shepherd had put it. Bird, Ben, all of them. The association might be using them, but the association might be the only protection a handful of miners had. The shepherds were the only independents with any kind of leverage. That was enough to advise keeping one's mouth shut, and not to say no. Couldn't tell Bird. Bird wasn't good at secrets. Damn sure not Ben. What had the shepherd said? The problem's major? The problem's gone, Major? Something had shifted. Ben's charts? Something the company had done? The dumbasses in the fire zone didn't get that kind of information. Turn in the recert application, Ben had said. Move on it. Way Out was headed for soon as possible launch. Dock time cost. Way Out was headed for soon as possible launch. Dock time cost. Ben swore he had friends who could get the test scheduled within the week, and Decker decided, in Bird's lack of comment, that Ben might be telling the truth. So it was a good idea to do that, Decker supposed, and found himself sitting in a trans car between Bird and Ben, nervous as a kid headed for the dentist, only beginning to calm down and accept the idea of taking an ops test before he'd gotten the shakes out of his knees. 10 days was soon enough, Bird said. Give him a little time. 10 days to get his nerves together. 10 days till he had to prove to BM that he still had it. That was still time enough to get the Class 3 license pushed through, Ben said, which he had to have before he could count any time at Way Out's boards. God, he couldn't blow this. Bird said, "After we get this done, we thought we'd take you up to the docks, show you the ship, all right?" "All right," he said, in the same numb panic, asking himself what they were up to. Show you the ship. Maybe they wanted to see if he could take it. Maybe they were pushing him to find out if he would go off the edge. Sudden memory of that fouled, cold interior, the suit drifting against the counter, the arm moving. He'd waked in the near dark and imagined it was Corey beckoning to him. Bird talked into his ear, talked about some of the damage on the ship, talked about what they'd done. But the ship in his mind was the one he remembered. The stink, and the cold, and the fear. "Yeah, admin," Ben said as the trans pulled up to a stop. "Here we are." He got up. He got off with them into an office zone, all beige and gray, with the musty cold electronics smell offices had. They went into the one that said ECSAA certifications, and Ben and Bird walked up to the counter with him. I want to apply for a license, he said. Recertification, Ben said, leaning his elbows on the desk beside him. Just let me do it. He couldn't think with Ben putting words in his mouth. He felt shivers coming on. He'd caught a chill in the trans, and he didn't want to be filling in applications with his hands shaking. Fine impression that was in this office. The clerk went away, came back with a data card, directed him to a side table and a reader. He went over to it, and his entourage came with him, one on either side as he put the card in the slot and made 3 mistakes entering his name. Look, you're making me nervous. That's all right, Ben said, and when he tried to answer the next question, about reason for revocation, Ben said. Neg. Say hospitalization. Look, the reason is a damned stupid doctor. They don't want the detail. Ben reached over and moved the cursor back. Don't explain. The only answer any department wants in its blanks is the wording in its rule books. Don't volunteer anything. Don't get helpful, and if you don't know, NA the bastard or shade it in your favor. Remember, it's clerks you're talking to, not pilots. Say hospitalization. That made clear sense to him. He only wished it hadn't come from Ben. Reason for application? Ben read off the form and pointed. Say, change in medical status. He hadn't thought of having to pass the physical again. The idea of doctors upset his stomach. But he typed what Ben said. Sign it, Ben said. Put your card in. That's all there is to it. It left a lot of blank lines. What about, are there any other circumstances? This is an 839 RC, Ben said, and tapped the top of the display, where it had that number. An 839 RC applies. That's all it does. It doesn't explain. It's not part of the exam. Just send it. Have you ever filled out one of these? Doesn't matter. I worked in assay. Answer by catchphrases. Don't pose the clerks a problem, or it'll go right to the bottom of the do pile. Don't be a problem. Send the bastard. Do it, Bird said. He keyed send. In a moment, the screen blinked, notified him his account had been debited $250 for the application, and told him he had to pass the basic operationals within 60 days, after which he had to log 200 hours in the sims or at the main boards of a working ship by sworn affidavit of a Class 1 pilot, and take a written exam. Someone had as well have hit him in the gut. He stood there staring at the message till Bird laid a hand on his shoulder and said they'd go on to the core now. He was down to $95 in his account. He hadn't yet paid his bill at the hole, and he'd never taken the writtens. He'd come up from a cargo pusher from the car. Let's take that paragraph from the top. He was down to $95 in his account. He hadn't yet paid his bill at the hole, and he'd never taken the writtens. He'd come up from the cargo pushers to the short hop beam haulers to a minor craft, but he'd never had to take the written exams. Ben elbowed him in the back. Come on, Moonbeam, don't forget your card. He took it out of the slate. He walked out of the offices with them, in a complete haze. They got to the trans station as the trans pulled in and the doors opened. Come on, Ben said, and Ben taking his arm was the last straw. He snarled, Let go of me, and shook free, wanting just to go on around the hell deck, wanting to go back to his room, lock the door, take a pill, and not give a damn for the rest of the day, or maybe 3 or 4 days. Come on! Bird got his arm and pulled at him. The trans doors were about to close in their faces. The robot voice was advising them to get clear. Oh, hell. Oh, hell, he said, and let them pull him aboard, because otherwise they were going to miss their ride and stand there till the next trans came, asking him why he was a damned fool. They fell into seats as the doors shut and the trans started moving. What in the hell's the matter with you? Ben asked. Are you being a spook again, Decker? No, he said, and slouched down into the seat, staring at a point between them.
You have some trouble about going on to the ship?
Bird asked him. No. He set his jaw and got mad, lifelong habit when people who ran his life crowded him. Ben said, "You're being a spook, Decker." Probably he was, he thought. And a kid might keep his mouth shut, but a grown man in debt up to his ears and about to end up on a heaviside job had finally to realize who he owed and how much. He swallowed against the knot in his throat and muttered, "I can't pass tests." Bird tilted an ear and said, louder,
What?
so he had to repeat it. "I can't take tests."
What do you mean you can't take tests?
Ben objected, loudly enough for people around them to hear.
You had a license, didn't you?
"Screw you!" he wanted to yell at Ben. "Let me alone." But he said quietly, "I had a license."
Without an exam? You can do that, Bird said to Ben. Construction work lets you do that. You can jump from class to class that way. Just the operationals and a few questions. Same as I did. Not everybody comes through the institute.
"Well then," Ben said, "you've been a class 1. You claim you were good. You know the answers. What's a test?" Ben made him mad. Ben could make him mad by breathing. He tried to be calm. "Because I can't pass written questions."
God,
Ben said, sliding down in his seat. "One of those. Can you read?" He didn't want to know what "those" Ben was talking about. He didn't want to talk about it right now. He wanted to break Ben's neck. He stared off at the corner, past Ben's shoulder. He'd go to the ship all right. He'd restrain himself from acting like a crazy man. He'd pass the operationals and put in his hours in Bird's ship, and he'd come back and fail the damned test. But meanwhile, he'd have gotten fed. He'd have gotten in with Bird. Maybe he could get a limited license to push freight, work up through ops again, on the ship construction out there. He didn't know. He didn't even know if it was possible out in the belt. He didn't want to worry about it right now. Just take it as far as he could, and not think about the mess he was in. Bird and Ben talked in low voices, and he was the topic. He could catch snatches of it over the noise. It was 2 more stops till the core lift. He wanted this ride over with. Wanted to get up to the dock, the ship, anywhere, to get them onto some other subject.
look, Ben said, leaning forward. On this test business, it's easy done. It's a system. There's a technique.
Easy for you?
You a halfway good pilot?
I'm damned good.
Then listen to me. It's the same as filling in the forms back there. Don't give real answers to desk pilots. The whole key to forms or tests is never give an answer smarter than the person who checks the questions.
He took in a breath, expecting Ben to have insulted him. He couldn't figure how Ben had.
We can get you through that shit, Ben said with a flip of his hand. But first, let's see if you're worth anything in ops.
He didn't want to owe Ben anything. He told himself that Ben had probably figured out a new way to screw him, and if there was any hope at all, it was that Ben's way of screwing him happened to involve his getting his license restored. Slave labor for him and Bird, maybe. That was all right from where he was. Do anything they wanted, as long as it got him that permit and got him licensed again. He thought about that till the trans came to their stop at the lift. They got out together, punched up for the core, and waited for the car. He tucked his hands into his pockets and tried not to think ahead, not to tests, not to the docks, not to what the ship was going to look like. Everything was going to be all right. He wasn't going to panic, wasn't going to heave up his guts when he went null G. It was just going to be damned cold up there, bitter cold. That was why he was shivering when he walked into the lift. He propped himself against the wall and took a death grip on the safety bar while the lift made the core transit. Increased G at the first and none at the end. Enough to do for a stomach in itself. The car stopped, let them out in the masked security zone, and they shoved their cards into the slot. The null G here at least didn't bother him. It only felt as if he was back in a familiar place, and wasn't, as if he were time tripping again. In his head, he knew R2's mast wasn't anywhere he'd been before when he was cognizant. He kept Bird in sight to keep himself anchored, hooked on and rode the handline between Ben and Bird. The booming racket, the activity, the smell of oil and cold and machinery, all of it could have been R1. Here and now, he kept telling himself, and by the time he reached Way Out's berth in refit, his stomach might have been upset, but he could reason his way toward a kind of numbness. Even entering the ship wasn't the jolt he'd thought it would be, following Bird and Ben through the lock. Bird turned the lights up, and the ship seemed ordinary again. It smelled of disinfectant, fresh glue, and oil. He touched Way Out's panels with cold, numbed fingers and looked around him. Everything around him was the way it had been, as if the wreck had never happened. Same name as she'd had, Corey's joke, actually, but they'd given her a new number, and she wasn't his and Corey's anymore. Most of all, there was no sense of Corey's existence here. That had been wiped out too. And maybe it was that presence he'd been most afraid to deal with.
"We've got the tanks replaced," Bird was saying, reorienting toward him. "We're stalled on one lousy part we're trying to organize on the exchange market, but we're closing in on finished."
"How does she look?" Ben asked, point blank, and he could say, calmly, without his teeth chattering, "You've done a lot of work on her."
"Want to get the feel of the boards?" Bird asked. "Main system's hooked in. Want to run a check?"
He knew then what they were up to, bringing him up here. They were running their own ops test. They wanted to see on their own whether he was missing pieces of his mind. Just a simple thing, bring the boards up, run a check. He took a breath of the bitter cold. He hauled down and fastened in at the main boards, uncapped switches and pushed buttons. Didn't have to think about them, didn't think about them, until he realized he'd just keyed beyond the simple board circuit tests. Memory flooded up. Fingers had keyed the standard config queries, and he could breathe again. Didn't damn well know where he was going, didn't know exactly at what point he was going to make himself terminate, or whether they wanted him to run real checkouts that fed data onto the log. Number 4 trimjet wasn't firing. He caught the board anomaly in the numbers streaming past, the rapid scroll of portside drift. He compensated with a quick fade on 2 and kicked the bow brakes to fend off before the yaw could carry him further. Not by the book. He knew it a heartbeat after he'd done it. The screen went black. The examiner said, "Been a cargo pusher, haven't you?" He said, trying not to let the shakes get started, "Yeah, once." The examiner understood, then, what he'd done, and why. The examiner, he was a man and old, punched a button. Numbers came up, 2 columns. Graphs followed. "You're a recert," the examiner said. "Trying to be," he said. He kept his breath even, watched as the examiner punched another set of buttons.
"You can take your card out."
"Did I pass?"
"D-class vessel, class 3 permit with licensed observer."
The examiner keyed out.
"Valid for a year. You in the Institute?"
"Private," he said, and the examiner gave him a second look.
"Who with?"
"Maury Bird, Trinidad."
"Hmm."
He wished he dared ask what that meant. But examiners in his experience didn't say what your score was, they didn't discuss the test, they rarely asked questions. This one made him nervous, but he thanked God the man was more than a button pusher. He must be. He left the simulator room with his card in hand, took the B-spoke core lift down to the ECSAA office, feeling the shakes finally hit him while he was at the certifications desk getting the license. Shakes so bad he had to put his hands in his pockets for fear the office staff might see it. Damn warning light had failed in the sim. Or he'd flat failed to see it till it showed in the numbers. You never knew which. An alarm might have been blinking, he might have missed it, he might have just timed out. It felt like that time wasn't moving right when those numbers started going off, when he'd had to do a fast and dirty calc and just thought it was a tight-in situation. He had no idea why. His brain just told him it was, and he'd imagined impact where there wasn't any such thing in the simulation. No, damn it, the sim had increased G sharply, and for one sick moment he'd hallucinated that the engines were firing. Maybe it was just his nerves. He wasn't sure anymore. Maybe that was the problem. Uh-oh, Meg said, seeing Decker come out and down the admin strip. They'd taken time out of the shop to shepherd Deck back. In case it's bad news, she'd said, and Sal had agreed. So, knowing he was already nervous, they hadn't told him they were close by, hadn't come down with him, just called and asked a certification office secretary how long a D3 permit exam might take, and they'd come down from the 3-deck shop to be here, in case. Doesn't look good, Sal said, and Meg had a moment of misgivings, whether they shouldn't just duck back and try to blend with the trans-stop bleh, whether they shouldn't just duck back and try to blend with the trans-stop traffic. Not easy in her case, and not easy in Sal's. So there was no chance for cowardice. She waved. Or maybe on second thought, they might make it away unseen. Decker was walking along looking at his feet, off in some different universe. She said, as he came close, "Deck, how'd it go?" He looked up, looked dazed, as if he couldn't quite figure them being there, or hadn't really heard the question. "How'd it go?" Sal asked. "All right," he said. "So, did you get the permit?" "Yeah." "So bravo, June Rab!" Sal clapped an arm around him and gave him a squeeze. "We said, didn't we?" He was dead white. He looked scared, and a little Z'd. "I said I'd call up to the ship, tell Bird how it came out. I need a phone." Deep spaced, Meg thought uneasily. Got himself through the test in one piece and just gone out. God hope they hadn't spotted it in the office. She linked her arm through his, protective custody. "Come on, phone and lunch, in that order." He went with them. They found a public phone near the trans station, and she punched through to Bird. Bird said, "Good," when he heard, and Ben said, in the background, "So what's the fuss?" Break that man's neck someday, Meg thought, with my own bare hands. Another damned breakdown in D28, and a pump connection had blown out in the mast at dockside, spraying 800 liters of hydraulic fluid into free fall toward the rotating core surface. The super swore it was worker sabotage, and Salvatore, with 3 more cases on his desk, had a headache. He put a tech specialist on the investigation, poured himself a cup of coffee, and told himself he had to clear his desk. The stacks of data cards in the bin had reached critical mass. Admin was having a fit over the quarterly reports being a week late. It had a fleet lieutenant on its lap bitching about a schedule shortfall, and he couldn't find the cards on the current flags referenced. Flag on Walker. The guy had card use near an office break-in, had no business there. No apparent relation to the crime, merely a presence that didn't make sense. Flag on Kermidge, every sign of resuming bad associations. Flags on Decker, blew hell out of the Sims. He keyed up the subfile. Will's voice said, out of the comp, "Decker passed his D3 ops. Score shot straight to the chief examiner. Word is the Sims jumped out of D class and ran clear up in C before the examiner terminated the test. Standard if there's an overrun. The certifications office suspects a suspension at a higher grade. Started searching court records, potential inquiries to Saul. Oh shit. I intercepted it, told them to let the license stand at a D3, pending inquiry with this office. I hope that was all right. Thank God. I did check the examiner's record in the files. Retired pilot, ECI training, Saul based, good record, 3 years in his present position, etc. He's clean. But here's another interesting development. Bird and Pollard, the ones who brought him in, that got his ship on salvage, that are staying in the same sleepery, they've filed to run pairs, refit shakedown run with Decker's former ship leased to one Katie and Abujib. Decker's on that application as a D3 wanting board time. Here's the catch. Abujib and Katie have records. Katie's as long as your arm. Smuggling, RAB agitator. Solcorp background, opted here on an EC transfer. Abujib's an AIP dishonorable discharge, reckless endangerment with a spacecraft, Shepard background, small-time morals charges, one assault, bashed some guy with a bottle. Allocations hasn't ruled yet. Deny or let pass? Salvatore hit pause, sat there with his elbows on the desk, reached for his inhaler, thinking, son of a bitch. Not about Wills. Wills had done a good job, so far as it went. The business with the examiner jangled little alarms, no less than the immaculate Bird's shadowy associations. Report that finding to Payne's office? Payne had said, we don't need to drag this out. The report to the ECSAA said mechanical failure, no fault of the pilot. Payne wanted the case closed, but damn it, it kept resurfacing in the flags, and now with Will's information came the niggling worry that there were some anomalies in official records. Whoops. And now with Wills's information came the niggling worry that where there were anomalies in official records, there might also be management secrets. Salazar's threatened lawsuit, contractor disputes, the rash of incidents on the dock and in the plants, the military making demands to install security personnel on R2, some kind of readiness survey involving their contracts, which was, one could suspect, strongly tied to schedule slowdowns, and, damn it, an implication of blame for his department. It was the whisper in the company washrooms that the fleet was putting heavy pressure on Aztec's management. The Earth Company was worried about sabotage and slowdowns, possibly sympathizer activity. The labor agitators were looking for the right moment to embarrass the company, and damned right the radical fringes of all sorts were looking for a way to get control of the labor movement. Radical fringe elements Aztecs had more than its share of, thanks to the EC's policy of letting malcontents and malefactors transfer out here. Sans trial, sans publicity, that might catch media attention in the Motherwell, where strikes and welfare riots and lunatic religions fed on the airwaves. This Katie was probably a prime example, but monetary rather than political. That was no problem. Shepard connections? Shepards had more kids than they could find slots for. Reckless endangerment? An ECSAA violation. Not this office's province, and any shift on Hell Deck could provide 3 and 4 assaults and a few cases for the medics. Aztec security had a damn sight more on its mind than a couple of small-time malcontents in a disputed minor craft. Decker was a watch-it, but Decker had so far done nothing worse than show up an anomaly on a simulation. Better than average. Meanwhile, management had a ship over at that classified facility way behind schedule, and sabotage in a plastics plant that had no damned reason except a fool of a manager. Hell no. It wasn't the Aztecs board that was going to take the damage. Whoops. Hell no, it wasn't the Aztecs board that was going to take the damage. Boards were never to blame. Aztecs management wasn't to blame. Dump it on security. Dump it on Salvatore's desk. So what had he got but a missing kid with a Mother on Mars Corp board whose lawyers were threatening a negligence suit against the mechanic at R1 and trying to get those records opened? Decker had had one incident, making wild charges against the company, but he had been quiet since then, had spent money on clothes, on food. His only current sin was applying for a recert in D class when he might, he read through Wills's report, had rated higher. Have rated higher. These sentences are long. You did have to wonder about some ringer thrown in at higher levels, somebody working for some investigatory office, even. For some investigate. This one threw me last time, but I was muted at the time, so you didn't know it. Let's try this again. You did have to wonder about some ringer thrown in at higher levels, somebody working for some investigatory office, even, in these nervous days, something that should come to the attention of MI. Blow the Decker case wide and he could kiss his career goodbye. But if he failed to report a problem and let something slip, his competence was at issue. Hell of a crack to be in. In his most paranoid moments, he was moved to ask had there ever been a Corey Salazar. But there was no doubt about Decker on any level he could assess. The various departments over at R1 had his background from 2 years back, and no clandestine operator would be so stupid as to ring bells on a test. It didn't in any wise smell like an EC probe or a security problem. Hell, Decker had had his D1 from back in 20. He'd had working experience since, and very possible. Whoops. Hell, Decker had had his D1 from back in 20. He'd had working experience since, and very possibly he'd been dogging it back in 20, lying low from the military recruiters. That behavior was an epidemic among draft-age males. With that medical against him, he'd put out everything he had, and very nearly brought himself back to Ms. Salazar's attention. Thank God Wills had put a stop to that. So Decker wanted to go back to space. It didn't seem a bad place to have him right now. You couldn't be quieter than out in the deep belt, with no communication with anyone but BM. Alice Salazar's lawyers couldn't serve him a summons there without a damned long arm. Memo the doctor on Decker's case to sign the medical release and satisfy the meddling clerk with the ECSAA rule book. Get Decker out and off the daily flags, and if Decker went psycho out there and slash-murdered Bird and Pollard, they should have known what they were getting into. Only hope you got Katie and Abujib with them. They didn't need the tag end of the Rab acting up. So, with the push of a few keys, that was one problem off his desk for 3 months. A fix good the minute that ship cleared dock. Flag its return. Flag, God, Bird and Pollard, Abujib and Katie. Have Wills's office run down all the data trails they might have left, at leisure. In a situation that could blow up again, on any whim of Salazar's lawyers, upper echelons could come down demanding complete files. Pity, Salvatore thought, he couldn't sign up a few other problems for a 3-month cruise in the belt. Like the manager of D28, with his dress codes and his inspections and his damned constant memos about sexual conduct off the job and his rules about mustaches. God, he'd like to memo Payne that department manager Colin R. Sabich had a private problem with kink vids, but owning the vids wasn't illegal and the fact wasn't relevant to anything but the fact that Sabich was a slime. Admin knew that. Admin had already promoted him sideways 3 times, and evidently couldn't find anywhere less critical to put him. What else could you do with the son of a bitch with a kink and an institute degree in plant management? God knew, maybe they'd give him an administrative office to run. Chapter 15. One thing had started going right, Decker thought. God, and another thing followed. A message turned up in the bar's mail file at breakfast, addressed to Mr. M. Bird from Belt Management. Special permit granted for 2 ship operations in the same sector. launch permit and all, usual permits for loading and charging, etc., etc. They had a second assignment. They'd get that and the charts when they boarded. They had a launch date, September 18th, 4 days from now. Bird had shaken his head over that, one of those damned do-it-now decisions from BM. No different at R2 than at R1. You expected a delay, you applied early, and you got a go yesterday. First the offer from Bird, then a piece of his license back, and Ben turning downright civil. Now BM approved a joint run. And still nothing fell apart. Decker sat holding his coffee cup, listening to the regulars at the bar congratulate Bird on BM's good behavior, with the recollection that the last time in his life things were going this right. But he didn't let himself think about that. He just stared at where he was and told himself that the letter had to be a sign his luck had turned, or maybe a signal from BM that management had decided to dog somebody else for a while. Who knew? Maybe somebody had slipped up and nobody had noticed he was on the crew. Maybe BM was signaling it would just drop its feud with him and let him pick up his life if he would just keep his mouth shut. Don't worry about might be's, was the way Meg had put it. Just keep your head. Don't make noise. Mom bitch has a real short-term crisis sense. There'll be some new sod on her grief list next week, and she'll forget all about you. He truly wanted to believe the wreck might be a closed case, but experience told him no desk sitter ever bothered to track and erase what some other desk sitter had sent into files. That medical report and everything else in the files was going to surface time after time for the rest of his life. He was sure of it. A file uncatchable in its course through the company computers. Probably every time he applied for a sector assignment. Damn sure if he tried to certify into C3. And BM was putting him back to work, officially. Still with no real resolution of what had happened. No answer. No justice. It was a cover-up Corey's mother evidently couldn't breach. He was sure she had to know by now, at least the official version. So what was he supposed to do that a mother on the MarsCorp board couldn't? He thought about writing Alice Salazar directly, send her his own account of what had happened. Never mind, Ms. Salazar hated him with a passion. But mail went through a lot of hands before it went out of R2. If anyone's mail found its way to special attention, his was 100% certainty. He'd gotten that canny by now. So it looked as if they were really going, and all he had to do was hold on to his nerves and stay out of trouble till launch, hope if the permit was a mistake nobody caught it in time, and try, meanwhile, to believe that Ben had really meant it just now when Ben had slapped him on the shoulder and said, in his subtle way, that in spite of him being an ass, he might actually work out. Bird pocketed his data card and remarked that since BM had a hurry up on, they had a last few things to do in the shop, and they'd better get at it. Sal said, all right, Bird. God, we put in 50 hours this week. And Bird said, yeah, plenty all right if the shower doesn't work. Won't get any sympathy from me. So it was a last-minute rush of things that had waited. No really vital jobs. They hadn't applied for their run without the big items latched down and way out past the mandatory ECSAA inspection. But Bird wanted some cleanup, and the shop offered a refuge where a body could sit, put screws in holes, and test circuits without a thought in his head, except the job he was on. And he personally had no objections. Anything that kept his hands busy. Ben came and went, handling the legwork. Meg and Sal worked in the shop, raked over old lovers, the quality of hair dye, a vid they couldn't agree on. Chatter, just chatter. Human noise. They looked strained. Tired, yes. But he kept having the feeling that it was more than that. He didn't think. He didn't want to think. Day before launch. He was holding on. Sal was frazzled. Bird grew short.
Launch nerves, Meg said under her breath. Bird, damn it, just take it easy. We got it covered.
It's a far walk after supplies, Bird snapped, and went off for another all-day stint on dockside, despite them arguing with him that old Bones had as well get all the heavy time they could get.
Can't argue with him,
Meg sighed, and Bird sent Ben down with a basket full of odd bits of Trinidad's works he wanted serviced 36 hours before launch. Why in hell, Sal moaned, didn't he see about this 8 weeks ago? Ben just shook his head. Does it every damn time. Everything's a will pass until he gets to packing the supplies in. Then this latch has got too much give, and he's remembered we had a condensation problem last run. It kept their hands busy. It took their minds off the passing hours. Decker understood Bird's state of nerves. Eventually, please God, they'd board and start launch routines, and, Decker thought, he might make it off R2 still sane.
What kind of vids do you like?
Meg asked him, while he was testing a pressure switch. He shrugged, figuring Meg meant they were going to rent a few for the trip, for all the spare time they weren't going to have, and he'd used to like the action stuff, but now that he thought about it, that wasn't what he wanted right now. Corey had made fun of his taste for his bloody offals. That was what she'd called them. But now he feared he'd never see an explosion in a vid without feeling that awful slam in the gut. He filed that away in the odd total of silly, simple things he'd been robbed of in the wreck. Maybe he could handle it someday, but not now. Right now he just wanted to keep all that at an arm's length. One step at a time, Mr. Decker.
Deck,
Huh?
you want to go out tonight?
He shook his head. No, he said sharply. He didn't mean to be rude, but it was the truth. He didn't want to go watch blow things up. He didn't want any dark theater. God knew he didn't want any suspense. Didn't know what he did want to do 24 hours before launch. But that wasn't it. Oh, come on, Sal said. What about dinner? We can talk Bird into spending money. Something très genteel. Candles and tablecloths. Give ourselves plenty of time to get through, get in, and clean up. What do you say? Dinner at 1900, cruise the bars, say au revoirs over the deck? Whoops. Dinner at 1900, cruise the bars, say our au revoirs along the deck. Yeah, he said finally. Being with people tonight was probably a good idea. Meg and Sal were trying to include him in their festivities, trying to draw him into their conversation. But now that he'd committed himself, he felt a kind of panic, as if by joining in he'd somehow stepped over an edge he'd really rather reconsider. He had no friends but these people, no future but what they'd arranged for him. They made their jokes, they talked to him. He answered what they asked, one side and the other of a trip for soft drinks and a package of chips. But this attitude kept coming over him. A blow-it-away kind of attitude. Resentment. Outright rage at their trying to get at him. They had everything he owned, and now they wanted his consent to it. Now they wanted the resentment that had kept him alive. Stupid way to feel, he thought, but their friendliness and Ben's made him mad. And he tried to figure out why, and not to be, as Ben called him, an ass. But, damn it, everything hit nerves. Even their before launch dinner. He'd done the same with Corey. Corey didn't make off-color jokes about the men she'd slept with. Sore spot there. His mind was full of pits he didn't want to look into this afternoon. Pre-launch jitters triggering memories. God only knew what was going on with him. And that tumbling, out-of-control feeling he'd had after the wreck was still there, making it impossible to take his life for granted. All the pieces were out of order. Everything felt new, dislocated. Rab said do, act, move, be. But move where? Be what? Meg and Sal had their heads together, talking in low voices, protecting some secrecy they wouldn't admit to. But they wanted him to take their lead. They'd dressed him like some damn doll, Not a joke at his expense. Far too serious for that. They had designs for him he didn't think he had as much to do with sex as with way of life. Making bitter jokes, flaunting their difference, trying to drag him away from Corey's way of doing things and back into the blind outrage he'd used to feel. Wake up, kid. Join us, kid. Be like us. Be with. Think like us. And survive. Maybe it was friendship. Be grateful, he told himself. Go out with them. Mind your manners. Today's enough. There's worse. There's hell and a way worse to have fallen in with. There's the people that run this place. He was back on the ship for a moment, and back again sitting in the shop with a small valve switching assembly in his hand and no memory of whether he'd just started or just finished with it. Panic shot a chill through him. He sat there staring at the piece and trying to figure out what he was doing with it. That's the last. Sal snatched it from his hand and tossed it into the basket. God, Dick, come on, give it up. We're done. It wasn't anything he couldn't fix with a screwdriver if it stuck later. Nothing vital. Potential malfunction wasn't what scared him. It was the gap he'd slid into. Damn nervous wreck, Sal thought, wiping sweat, kicking the Nulgy cart's wheels out. This one's wheels stuck. The rental office swore they didn't have another. Get us all out of here. Bang! You lifted one end and rammed it at the floor. 2 times freed it up. Abu Jim, someone said. She turned about with an intake of breath. Mitch's friend. You're still launching on the 18th? Yeah? Don't depend on it. Shit! What's going on? That's the word. Keep a line on your problem. A tight line. Why? The shepherd said, You got that thing I gave you? Not on me. I don't go to the core with it. I want you to bring it to the club tomorrow. No advance word to Katie, no word to anybody. Just bring that, your friend, and your problem. We gotta launch tomorrow, she started to object. The universe turned around that point. Everything in their minds did, with manic concentration. Tomorrow, the shepherd repeated. She felt her heart sink. She thought, my God, Bird and Ben have everything they own tied up in this run. They can't not launch tomorrow. Meg and me be damned, they can't not go tomorrow. You don't back out this close. My bitch won't change a launch date. That's not in our control, the shepherd said, and walked away.
Why don't you come with us? Whoops. Why don't you come with me?
Meg asked him.
Sal's going to run that last batch up to Bird, and if he tries to give us another lot, we'll say, sorry, the shop's closed. You and I can get cleared out of here and turn the keys in. I'm going to pick up a few things at Ward's, maybe stop for coffee.
He shook his head. I've got gym time to do. It was the only escape he could think of. He couldn't take Meg's company right now, couldn't risk timing out with her, if that was what he had just done. He left. He didn't even realize how stupid the excuse had been until in the lift down he remembered he'd left Meg with a heavy tool case to carry to the rental office. By then, it was too late to go back and catch her, and he had no idea what to do with himself but go to the gym. Nothing seemed solid of a sudden. Nothing in his life was in order. Time worried him. He was free-falling, too scared to admit just now he'd been on autopilot and didn't know it. Scared that a hatch shutting behind him was going to start him unraveling. The blip was still moving. No question. Corey argued with him. "It's the biggest chance we'll ever have." A piece of memory clicked in, quietly, just there of a sudden with that sense of frightened foolishness. He'd realized the danger in the driver, and he'd folded the argument, folded the way he'd folded with Sal up there. He'd had the ship completely in his hands, but he'd been afraid to be afraid. He'd let Corey's college education convince him she was right when his gut was telling him a silent, advancing driver the company's charts didn't show wasn't playing by the rules she understood. Corey, who knew Mars Corp inside and out, had said, "We're going to call their bluff. They're in contact with BM every damn minute." And he'd frozen. He couldn't say, "Corey, this scares hell out of me." He'd been too scared of Corey's education to say, "Corey, this is just damned stupid." She'd say, now, if she were here to say it, "Well, I really blew that one, didn't I?" And he wouldn't. He couldn't talk, couldn't get his words straight when he thought he could sound like a fool. So he'd protected his damned soft spot, and Corey had died. He bumped into someone. He mumbled an apology and kept walking, playing that moment over and over in his mind. They'd been invulnerable. Then. Nothing was going to turn out wrong. She'd made a bad choice, but rocks were her department. The ship was his. The company was crooked as hell, but he could call their bluff. He could make that ship listen. He'd backed a wrong call. He'd known it, and he'd done it. That was what he had to look at and look at till it burned his way into his brain. And with that, I am going to have to call it for the day. 2 more streams, provided I don't have more technical issues or other scheduling problems. And then we will be done with Heavy Time by CJ Cherryh. Hope people are digging it so far. I certainly am. It's a book I'm quite fond of, by an author I'm quite fond of. Alrighty, so I do this every week on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud, such as this from Heavy Time by CJ Cherryh. I also have other streams throughout the week. I've got a Mecha Mondays stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. And I have a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do something Warframey for a couple hours. Alrighty. All the relevant links to see that stuff is in the stream description. The YouTube links are where you're going to want us to go to for all the archived stuff. I'll have to update. Actually, they're mostly current for Heavy Time at least. I'll have to get this one on there soon. But otherwise, yeah. Have a good one. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, stay toasty if it's cold, stay cool if it's warm, and otherwise, be decent to each other. Alrighty, see you all next time, and enjoy